Okay, guys, so this week I wanted to give you a little orientation for our second discussion board. We have two this week, and uh, this orientation will, I hope, just situate it a little bit for us. So, when this course was designed, which is before I came to this university, um, the idea behind this week was that we would have a discussion that would be controversial, that we could sort of sink our philosophical teeth into. And so I've chosen one that is controversial, not so controversial that it's problematic, I think, but one that, again, we can kind of jump into and give some varying opinions about. Uh, so the state of Texas and now some other states in the U.S. have um, moved to implement a law that requires the display of the Ten Commandments or something like it in all public schools and universities in the state. Um, actually, the first to do this was the state of Louisiana. Louisiana made it famous, and the way I describe it in the reading here for the discussion, it's with the state of Louisiana. Um, and this is, this is a very interesting development. Uh, a lot of this movement is to be found in Texas, Louisiana, and Florida. The uh, the idea here is that all the schools are going to have to display this bit of teaching from this particular religious tradition. And keep in mind, this isn't just kids. This is you guys. This is university level uh, schools. They are required by law to display this. Um, the law in Texas has been put on hold by a court. That had happened, I think, also in Louisiana, but I'm not sure what the current status of that is. I think the law has gone forward, if I'm not mistaken. Um, so, look, you know, you may think this is a good thing, you may think this is a bad thing as far as a development politically here. But I think we can all agree, we should all agree, it is at least a surprising thing. In other words, um, this would not be surprising if this were Iran or Saudi Arabia, Pakistan perhaps. But in the U.S., this is quite surprising given our traditions of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, separation of church and state. A lot of you may not realize many other parts of the world, including democratic parts of the world, do not have either nearly so strong a tradition of the separation of church and state or a very different type of separation. Much of Europe, for example, has established churches, official churches. Great Britain has uh, an established, at least in the part which is England, it has the the Anglican Church is the established church. The monarch is the official head of it, and I mean there have been some reforms to the House of Lords, but traditionally, and I think it's still the case, certain seats in the House of Lords are automatically apportioned to um, certain archbishops. I think two archbishops in the Church of England. They are automatically members of that house in the Parliament. That's that sort of thing is very, very different than the traditions here. In addition, several Scandinavian countries have, and not just Scandinavian countries, have official churches. It's mostly the Lutheran Church in some of those states. And in fact, their salaries are paid by the state. Your taxes in those countries um, go to support. Uh, I think it's still the case in Sweden. Go to support uh, certain Lutheran ministers in the state. That grates on American ears. Most Americans would find that a bit strange, I think. Whether you agree with it or not, again, it's quite different than what we have here in the States as far as our traditions. Um, on the other hand, next door to us, south of us, Mexico, has what is in some ways a more stringent separation of church and state. In Mexico, for many decades now, many, many years, priests have not been allowed to perform marriages. Marriages are all in Mexico officially carried out by the state. There's no such thing as a legal marriage performed by priests in Mexico, though they do perform a marriage ceremony. It's not official. In fact, technically, it's even illegal for a priest to wear his garb, his official priestly clothes, out in public, though I'm not so sure that's enforced that much. So they have a very strong separation of church and state. In fact, really, I mean, according to the Constitution in Mexico, it's an anti-clerical constitution. It's contrary to priests rather than so much the church in itself. But at any rate, this is a, as I said, sort of a surprising set of events here in the U.S. And it actually, as it's part of a larger movement. I mean, there's a sort of resurgence of a sort of militant religious activism in this country. And again, that, you know, you may agree with that, you may not, but it's at least newsworthy and noteworthy. For example, here in Texas, where I am, the state has, led by these same leaders in the legislature and in the political system, have now moved to start banning certain work, even certain terms are not used. Texas A&M University, which by some measures is the largest university in America, has now banned some of the writings of Plato, the philosopher from 2,500 years ago. In fact, I almost posted for you an article about this from The Economist, the British news magazine. In fact, some faculty have been fired at Texas A&M for using unacceptable, there's now certain unacceptable terms. It has to do with, transgender people, gay people, etc. In fact, that's why the Symposium, which is a classic work of literature of Plato, has now been banned at Texas A&M University, because the Symposium Plato offered this sort of myth about how, about love, different aspects of love. That's why the Symposium is so famous. And one part of that is about gay people, and that is considered inappropriate now by some of these political and religious leaders in Texas, and so they've moved to, again, officially through the power of the state, because the governor in Texas names trustees to public universities in the state, so that's how they can exercise this power to ban certain works, ban certain terms, etc. So it's an interesting development. Again, you may think it's a good development, maybe you feel like we need this, but it is, certainly we can agree, it is an interesting development. You know, the Catholic Church has maintained for many years an official index of forbidden works. You don't hear much about it anymore. Historically, it was very famous. You know, Galileo's works were put on the index, Voltaire, many famous writers. And it's famous because the church, has a reputation for moving very, very slowly about this. Galileo, whose works were put on the index in the early 1600s, was not removed until, I believe, 1992. So the church moves at a very slow pace here. It finally said, okay, Galileo, we'll let you slide on that bit about the Earth revolving around the sun instead of the other way around. So it's kind of interesting, but the index does still exist. In fact, I was at another institution just a few years ago. I was at the bookstore, and I walked up to pay for my item, and the clerk, the young lady behind the counter, I guess it was a slow day, so she was reading a book. And I said, hey, what are you reading? And she was reading one of the books by Dan Brown, the novelist who wrote these sort of mystery things, And I said, oh, okay, what led you to choose that book to read? She says, because my priest told me not to read it. And I said, you read what your priest says not to read? She said, yes, every year he tells us the works not to read, and that becomes my reading list. I go out and I buy those books. Those are the books I want to read. He provides me my summer reading list. I thought that was interesting. So in one sense, this is sort of the state creating its own index by having forbidden works. Now, I don't know if this has happened in Florida or Louisiana, but it's happening here in Texas, and we'll see what happens. This is, an interesting development. It's at least surprising. At any rate, so I just want to give you some orientation here. Now, look, here's one thing to keep in mind about this: the mistake. And if you watch this video, hopefully you'll be prevented from making this mistake on this week's posting. Look, the issue here is not should we allow schools to post the Ten Commandments on the wall. That is not the issue. Keep in mind, guys, schools have always been able to post the Ten Commandments. There's no law that prevents that. The issue here is about a law that requires the posting of the teachings of a particular religious tradition. This is not about allowing. They have always been allowed. It's about requiring. And that's because then, of course, you have all the issues about all the other religious traditions. The state of Louisiana, they were the first state to do this. Louisiana has many, many thousands of Hindus. Texas has hundreds of thousands of Hindus, hundreds of thousands of Muslims. How do you handle this? Everybody, when you think of the Ten Commandments, you may think of, everyone tends to think of, I think, not to steal, not to murder. You don't think of things like, there's only one God and I'm it. That's the first commandment, I believe. So if a Hindu child or a Muslim child raises his hand and asks the teacher, what God is commandment number 1 talking about? Well, the teacher is going to what? Either say, I refuse to answer that, but that would be really strange. The teacher could lie and say, well, it's meant whatever your God is what it means. That is not true, right? If you go back and read the text, it is clear that it does not mean any God you want. There is a specific God, Jehovah. So that creates a tricky position. Now, maybe you think the teacher should say, yeah, it's the Christian and Jewish God. That's the one, kid. If you're not part of that, I'm sorry. But that's, so it certainly, maybe you think there's a good way around that. There's a good way to handle it. Okay. So this is an opportunity to talk about that in this week's discussion. So anyway, so it's something we can sink our teeth into, and I hope it is an opportunity for you to do that. All right? So keep the candle burning.